Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. We love to take a topic and really get into it. And this time, um, we've got a lot of questions about this one. It's something that a lot of you are really wanting to understand better, and it has to do with the experiences of adults on the autism spectrum.
Okay. Yeah.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at emotional hijacking.
Right.
And we've got some research articles to help us unpack this. But also, and I think this is going to be really valuable,
Yeah.
we have a blog post
Mm-hmm.
by an autistic adult who really shares their experiences very candidly.
Yeah, I think that's going to be helpful, to get that perspective because a
Yeah.
lot of the research can be kind of clinical and right.
Right. It's theoretical, and then to hear it from someone who's living it every day, I think that's really going to help bring this to life for us.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
I'm glad we're starting with the term itself
okay.
because, emotional hijacking, it's such a powerful way to describe that feeling of being overwhelmed by emotion.
It is. It really is. And I was thinking about that earlier and trying to come up with an analogy. It's like, those videos you see, like, of rogue waves just suddenly appearing and capsizing boats.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like that,
Right.
1 minute you're sailing along smoothly, and then the next minute you're just totally engulfed, and it's hard to know which way is up.
And it's unexpected.
And unexpected, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because
Mhm.
that analogy actually has like a real basis in how our brains work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there's this part of the brain called the amygdala,
Okay.
and it's basically like our emotional alarm system, right?
Okay.
So when we sense something that could be potentially like threatening or upsetting,
Right.
the amygdala is the thing that fires off these signals to get us ready to react.
Oh, okay.
And usually what happens is the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
It's just kind of like our brain's executive control center.
Okay.
It steps in and it helps us make a more rational decision about how we want to respond. But when an emotional hijacking is happening,
Mm-hmm.
the signal from the amygdala is so strong
Wow.
that it basically overrides the prefrontal cortex.
So it's like our emotional center is screaming emergency,
Yeah.
and our rational brain can't even get a word in edgewise.
Exactly. And this can happen to anyone, but for adults on the autism spectrum,
Mhm.
it can be a lot more frequent and intense.
I see.
Yeah.
And the blog that we have really brings this to life.
Oh, yeah.
The author, talks about how autistic people often face challenges with
Yeah.
emotional regulation
Mhm.
and also interpreting social cues.
Mhm.
And so you can imagine how those everyday interactions that a lot of us take for granted could very quickly become overwhelming.
Exactly. And it kind of ties into this concept of, have you ever heard of double empathy?
I have heard of it, yes.
Okay, so it basically suggests that communication breakdowns
Okay.
are more common between autistic and non-autistic people,
Oh, interesting.
simply because they're kind of approaching these social situations with different understanding, right? So like almost like speaking different languages.
Right.
So imagine like a non-autistic person, they're trying to understand why an autistic person might avoid eye contact. And the non-autistic person, they might see it as being rude,
Right.
while the autistic person might be feeling super overwhelmed by the intensity of eye contact.
That makes sense.
So it's like,
It's a different way of experiencing the world.
it's a different way of experiencing the world, but because
Right.
those differences aren't always obvious to either side,
Mm-hmm.
it can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and frustration and anxiety, which can then lead to the emotional hijacking.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this one story in the blog
Yeah.
where the author describes being in a crowded store
Yeah.
and just having this like complete meltdown because of sensory overload.
Oh, wow.
Like all the bright lights, the loud noises,
Yeah.
strong smells,
It's just everything.
everything. And it's just a really powerful description
Yeah.
of how intense and unexpected those experiences can be.
Mhm. And how quickly they can happen, too.
Yes, yeah.
And it highlights, and you know how all these things we've been discussing can just collide.
Yeah.
The sensory overload triggers the emotional response, the amygdala hits the panic button, and the prefrontal cortex can't gain control.
Right.
It's just a recipe for feeling completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And then if the people around them don't understand what's happening,
Right.
that lack of empathy can make things so much worse.
Yeah. So knowing all this about emotional hijacking,
Mm-hmm.
what can you do if you're feeling swept away by those emotions?
Right.
The blog post actually offers quite a few different coping strategies.
Yeah.
What are some that really stand out to you?
Well, one that the author really emphasizes is self-regulation.
Okay.
And it's like learning to recognize and name your emotions as they're happening.
That seems so simple,
Hmm.
but I can see how powerful that could be.
Right.
Like if I can say to myself, okay, this is anxiety, I'm feeling anxious right now,
Yeah.
it's almost like it creates a little bit of distance between me and the feeling.
Exactly. It's like instead of being totally consumed by the emotion,
Yeah.
you're starting to observe it.
Right.
And that shift in perspective, even just that much,
Right.
can sometimes be enough to let your prefrontal cortex come back online.
And then hopefully you can start to like make a conscious choice about how you want to respond rather than just reacting on impulse.
That's the key. And mindfulness can really help with this.
Okay.
So things like focusing on your breath, noticing the sensations in your body, those techniques can help you stay grounded in the present moment,
Right.
which can be so calming during an emotional hijacking.
It's like you're hitting the pause button
Yeah.
on that wave of emotion.
Yeah, like that.
Just giving yourself a chance to like catch your breath and really assess the situation.
Yeah, and once you've kind of created that little bit of space, then clear communication can be super helpful.
Okay.
Being able to say, I need a few minutes to myself, or can we please turn down the music? Like, just being able to articulate those needs can make a huge difference in managing expectations.
Right.
And reducing that anxiety.
It's about advocating for yourself, setting those boundaries to protect your well-being.
Absolutely. And then there's sensory regulation, which we touched on a little bit earlier,
Okay.
which is all about figuring out what your triggers are,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe it's fluorescent lighting, maybe it's certain textures, or being in crowded social situations. Once you know what those triggers are, then you can start to brainstorm ways to, like, minimize your exposure,
Right.
or come up with some coping strategies for when those moments happen.
So it's about taking control of your environment as much as possible.
Exactly. And then there's the broader picture of self-care.
Good.
So making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating nutritious foods, doing things that you actually enjoy.
Right.
All of those things help with your overall well-being and resilience.
It's like building up that strong foundation so that when those emotional waves do hit, you're better equipped to kind of weather the storm.
I love that analogy. And it's not about trying to eliminate those emotions altogether.
Right.
They're a natural part of who we are.
Yeah.
It's about developing the skills and strategies to navigate them.
This reminds me of something else that was highlighted in some of those research articles.
Okay.
The connection between emotional hijacking and burnout.
Oh, absolutely.
Burnout, like we all know, is that state of chronic exhaustion, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
And it can be really common among autistic adults.
Especially
Those who feel like they're constantly having to navigate a world that's not designed for them.
Right. It's exhausting to always be on high alert and managing those really intense emotions.
Right.
And, maybe even feeling like they have to mask their true self to fit in.
Oh, masking. And that's another thing that came up a lot in the research.
Yeah.
This idea of like hiding or camouflaging autistic traits to try to appear more neurotypical.
Right. And while it might seem helpful in certain situations in the short term, it's so draining over time.
It's like putting on a performance all the time.
It is, yeah.
And that takes a toll.
It does. And when you're constantly doing that, it makes it even harder to really connect with your true self.
Right.
And understand your own emotions.
It creates this disconnect between what you're feeling on the inside and then what you're projecting on the outside.
Exactly. And that can make navigating those social situations even trickier.
Yeah.
And increase the likelihood of those emotional hijacking moments.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It really is. So I think, what does all this mean for you listening right now? First of all, it's crucial to understand that emotional hijacking, this is a real phenomenon. It's not a personal failing. It's not something you're choosing to do. It's something that happens.
It's your brain trying to protect you.
Exactly. And for autistic individuals, that response might be amplified because of differences in the way their brains are wired.
Right. It's not their fault.
Not at all. But here's the thing.
Okay.
Even though it can feel so intense and overwhelming,
Right.
there are things you can do to manage it.
Like all those strategies we talked about.
Exactly.
Self-regulation, mindfulness, clear communication, sensory regulation, self-care. Those are all things that you can start using today to regain control in those moments.
Yeah, and just as important as those tools is remembering that you're not alone in this.
Right.
There's a huge community of autistic adults who get it, who understand these challenges, and there are so many resources out there.
That's good to hear.
To support you.
Yeah.
Like finding a therapist who specializes in autism, that can be so helpful. And there are so many great online communities and support groups where you can connect with other people who really understand.
Yeah, it's about finding your people, those who get your unique way of being in the world.
Exactly. And, it's also about advocating for yourself and helping to create a world that's more inclusive and accommodating of neurodiversity.
Because when we embrace all minds, we create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a question to kind of ponder.
Ooh, I always love your thought-provoking questions.
So think about, your own relationship with your emotions.
Okay.
What are some patterns that you notice? What are some things that tend to trigger those really intense emotional responses? And knowing what we've talked about today, what's one small step that you could take this week to build your self-awareness and start to create your own kind of emotional toolkit?
That's such a powerful question. I've been spending some time thinking about that myself.
Yeah, self-discovery is an ongoing journey. But remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are so many people out there ready to support and cheer you on.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We started by defining emotional hijacking, kind of exploring like the neurological basis for why it happens. Then we looked at how this can be particularly challenging for adults on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
Connecting it to things like, double empathy, sensory overload, burnout, masking.
Right. All those different factors that play into it.
And most importantly, we talked about all those different strategies that can help people to, understand and manage those intense emotions.
So it's not about, getting rid of those emotions altogether.
Right. They're a natural part of being human.
Yeah, exactly. It's about learning how to work with them.
It's been such an insightful deep dive, and I really hope that you listening are walking away feeling more empowered and equipped with a new understanding.
Yes, a new understanding of yourself and others.
Beautifully said. So on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep embracing that amazing power of your unique mind.
Yes. See you soon.